Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to Palm Springs Church. We are glad you are here today. We have several aromas floating through the air. I can barely smell them. Today is the first day I've actually had my voice back in several days, and it may not last through the end of the sermon. So don't start clapping. I know you want to start clapping. Don't start. Joseph, if I could go ahead and get you to pull that PowerPoint up for us, please, sir. We've come to a point in our pursuit of Jesus where we're going to see something different from him today. We're going to see him, instead of us pursuing him, we're going to see him pursue us. And the question before us is, how do I recognize God's call on my life? And we use that word calling. Now, I understand it's a very churchy word. It's a very Christian word. Most of you don't go to work and go, man, I really love your calling. When you're talking about doing your income taxes, or when you're talking about whoever can do the computer programming, or whoever can do this or that. I just love your calling. I also understand, obviously, that I'm standing here as what some would call a professional Christian. So you're like, well, you have a calling. You're a preacher. All preachers have a calling. That's kind of the word that we've turned it into. When we talk about calling, we're talking about somebody who is called to preach God's good news. As Christians, I think we believe in several different types of calling. One would be a call to salvation. Jesus is calling me to be saved. We sing song, Jesus is tenderly calling today. So something along those lines. A call to salvation. We have a call to service. Whatever I have in my hands, whatever I'm capable of, God has called me to use that for the church. I think there's a little bit different thing when we talk about calling. We're going to talk about today a calling, and if you were with us for our reading, for Debbie's reading, 1 Samuel chapter 3, it's like y'all read my sermon again this morning. With 1 Samuel chapter 3, God speaks directly to Samuel. That's the calling we all want, isn't it? That way there's no mistake. I know what you want, God. I hear your voice. I know exactly what you want. Now, the problem with that is in some of our world today, if you hear voices like that, it might make you take some medication for that. I am persuaded that all of us have been called by God. All of us. We all have a calling, as it were. And you might not think it's for you, but I'm going to say, I'm going to disagree. If you say to yourself, God hasn't called me, maybe you don't understand what it is his calling is. Importantly, most importantly, is that even though I disagree with you, Jesus is going to disagree with you. Jesus disagrees when you say, I haven't been called. I have no calling. Jesus is going to say, oh no, 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 no. You. I have plans for you. I have things I want you to do. I need you in my kingdom. I need you to do things in my kingdom. You may have heard of this thing going around in the business world today called the Great Resignation, where hundreds of thousands of people are just saying, you know what? I'm not going to do that job anymore. Pandemic, starting in late 2019, running on through till now, has just got a lot of people reevaluating their position in life, what they're doing. And rather than calling it a great resignation, I want to call it a great reorganization. People are taking the time to back up, take a look at their life, take stock of their life, see what direction they're going in, see what it is that they want to do, see the things that interest them, and then put themselves into those positions to try and squeak out a living or to move forward in order to find happiness, the ever elusive happiness. When you look at life, as our friend told us from the comic books this morning, nothing stays the same, does it? There are three parts to life. There is the was, there is the is, and there is the can be. The was, we all understand that. That's what was in the past. The is the moment we're living in right now. That's the is. And then the can be is all the possibilities, the world of possibilities that are out here for us if we choose to move in that direction. Some of us, especially when it comes to churches, are wrestling and struggling because we think the was pretty great. Why, in my day? You ever heard that? Anytime somebody starts a conversation with that, my ears just automatically turn off. My sons do the same thing. My parents walked uphill in the snow both ways to school. To and from school, walked uphill with no shoes on, barefooted in the wintertime. 18 inches of snow on the ground, through briars and brambles and all the other good things there. Crossing 2 creeks. Had to cut down a tree and build a boat to get across the river. Some people look at was and say, you know what, wasn't really good. As it was mentioned by Debbie this morning and others, sometimes the was filled with turmoil. It's filled with pain, anguish, maybe even anger, resentment, bitterness, frustration, lack of hope. Perhaps you didn't have the money that you needed. Perhaps you didn't have the house that you needed. Perhaps you didn't have the job that you needed. Perhaps you didn't have the relationship that you needed or wanted. So when you think about was, you slam the door on that. I don't have any part of that. And so you work as diligently as you can in the is to make the was go away. The problem with was and is that we can get stuck there. We can get stuck in the past thinking everything was better back then, or we can get stuck in the here and now thinking I have got to accomplish these things right now. And we neglect or refuse to look at what can be. If all we do is put our posture in this direction, we're lost. We're stuck. Now, it's not a bad thing to look back and say, hey, I remember that. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to go there again. What can I do to prevent that from happening again? And as I said earlier, in our series, we have been pursuing Jesus. And today, if you want to turn over to Luke chapter 5, we're going to see Jesus pursue us. Now, he pursues Peter particularly in this story. But when we extrapolate that through time, it's Jesus' call to us as well. Our pursuit and the pursuit of Jesus takes us to the shore of a lake known in the area of Gennesaret, Galilee. Luke chapter 5, one day Jesus was standing by the lake. The people were crowding around him. This is not something that was rare, not something that was new. Every time we read about Jesus, people were crowding around him. They were listening to the word of God. One day, verse 1, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. Hey, I just said that. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from that boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep water, let down the nets for a catch. If you've ever been around a fishing area, there's a smell. Sometimes it's a good smell, sometimes it's not so pleasant. Dead fish tend to make a rotten smell. And these folks are seated around the lake. We're not told if there's a pier or a wharf there. I'm going to imagine that there's some kind of makeshift something there so they can land the boats. But there are boats on the shore. There are people crowded around. And in the background, you hear the fishermen talking, yelling at one another. There's all this activity. They're repairing nets. They're drying nets. Peter, looking at his empty boat, as we'll find out later, his wasn't very good. When you're a fisherman and you rely on catching fish in order to sell them, in order to make a living, to provide for your family, his was completely empty. There was nothing in his boat. His was, and his is, right now, is not very good. Because he's contemplating, what did I do wrong? We fished every part of the lake I know to fish, and yet we caught nothing. What am I going to do tonight? How am I going to go home to my wife and tell her, sweetheart, we didn't catch anything today or last night, and so we're just going to have to not eat today. There's all this activity. Peter's boat is there. There's another empty boat there. And Jesus is talking. And if you know anything about fishermen, he's probably having to yell over some of the salty language that's going on behind him. And he's here with the lake behind him and the people crowded around, and they continue to crowd around, and they continue to crowd around, and they continue to come and listen. And you've got going on in the background, and you've got nets drying, and you've got people yelling and screaming back and forth, and there's Jesus teaching. And then Jesus, when he had finished speaking, said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." There are two things to know here, I believe. First of all, Jesus didn't need that boat. Later on, we're going to find out that Jesus walks on water. If Jesus had wanted to, he could have just moonwalked right on back in the lake, nice and cool. Hey, look at me, everybody. I'm walking on water. He chose not to do that. He didn't need that boat. You know, perhaps we feel the same way about the boats in our lives. We feel like God doesn't really need our boat. Jesus, you don't need me. Jesus, you don't need what I have. You don't need my talents. You don't need what I have to offer. Or we make excuses. I'm going to tell you, I do. Jesus, you don't want my boat, but that guy over there, he's got a boat. You want to use his boat. Why are you looking at mine? It's all dirty and it's beat up and it's got holes in it. It'll sink any minute. Don't waste your time with me. He didn't need Peter's boat. And the second thing I want you to know is that he didn't have to ask permission. He's God. He's the creator of all things. He could have just easily walked up to the boat, gotten into it, and launched out into the water on his own. Or could have easily just ignored the boat altogether. But he didn't have to ask Peter permission. But he did. For some of us in the room, the shore is actually really comfortable. We don't want to be in our boats. But you know what, with Peter here, Jesus invited himself into his boat. Jesus invites himself into the boats of our lives as well. He always invites himself there and leaves it to us to respond. Peter needed to be willing to surrender. And this is where our calling comes in, because our calling is defined by obedience. Our calling is defined by obedience. If Peter wanted to experience the can be, he's had good experience with the was, he's had good experience with the is. If he wants to have an experience with the can be, it's going to require him to push away from the shore. It required him to be willing. It required him to be obedient to the calling that he has. And we know the rest of the story because we've read this story hundreds, maybe thousands of times. But Peter didn't know the rest of the story. When he pushed out from the shore, when he said yes, he might have thought, you know what, I'm just alone in this boat with the rabbi. Maybe for an hour or so, he can use this as a platform to continue to preach and teach. I don't think he knew that he was going to spend the next 3 years of his life side by side, lock in arm with the miracle worker. He didn't know that. He didn't know that because he was willing to push out a little from the shore, that he would see blind eyes open, that he would see the deaf regain their hearing, that he would see the dead raised to life. He had no idea about what can be. You and I don't know what God is willing and what God is wanting to do in the can be portion of our lives. But if we release our boat, if we'll give it to Him, if we'll step back and be obedient and push out, even when we don't know the result, God suddenly becomes the center of our life. If you're serious about this season of reorganizing, which I think a lot of us are, getting things straight, understanding where we're at may be still filled with all kinds of yucky stuff. And we're looking to what can be. We're going to have to get in that boat. We're going to have to push away from the shore. We're going to have to reorganize some things, rethink some things. And God is doing something different. He is doing something awesome. And He is calling us to be obedient. And Peter does it. Peter does it. He pushes off a little ways from the shore. He throws the anchor down, kind of sits on the side of the boat as Jesus continues to talk. We don't have any record of what Jesus said there on that day, but we could imagine the message. He would have probably repeated things that we're very familiar with. Things like turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love your neighbor, be the salt of the earth, be the light of the world. But when Jesus is done teaching, He says to Peter, hey, let's go fishing. That's not exactly what He said, but look what He says. It says, when He had finished speaking, He said to Simon, put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Now, Peter tries to be polite. Master, you might not know this, but, we kind of know what we're doing. Grew up around here. This is our family business. We understand what's going on. We understand where the fish are. We understand where the deep part of the water is that you're sending us into. We fished that part out. There's no fish there. We know that there aren't any fish there. As a matter of fact, we know there aren't any fish in the lake tonight at all because, look, I've got an empty boat. Worked all night. Tired. I've cast that net hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times. And each time I drew that wet, soppy, nasty smelling net back into the boat with just a little bit of hope and anticipation of finding at least one fish there, it came back empty every time. And now you're asking me to go out into the deep part. It's one thing to ask me to push off from the shore. Now you're really stretching my obedience here, asking me to go to the deep. You guys know I don't like deep water. I don't like shallow water either, for that matter. I'm on that boat. I'm like, actually, I wouldn't be on the boat to begin with. Peter doesn't know what awaits him. He thinks he knows what awaits him in the can be. I'm going to go back out here and I'm going to throw my nets overboard. And fishermen are a prideful lot. Did you know that? Anybody here ever have a fishing story? Dad and I went fishing and I came back with a fish that long. Peter's there on the shore. He's around all of his fishing buddies. He's had no luck all night long. And here comes this carpenter. Not the same trade. I'm sure he knows how to work. I'm sure he knows how to work hard. But he hasn't done this work and he hasn't been up all night like I've been up all night. And you want me to go out into the deep part of the Sea of Galilee. You're pushing it a little bit too far, Jesus. Pushing me a little bit too far. You're pushing my obedience. Are we there with Peter sometimes? When God calls us out into the deep and he says, hey, let's go fishing over here. Do we hesitate? Do we look at him and say, hey, you know what? I know more than you do. I'm a professional in this. Peter doesn't know anything of the can be, and yet everything hung in the balance. Peter only saw another trip out into the water that would likely be disappointing. And all Jesus was saying was be obedient. Be obedient. Take me fishing. Trust me with your boat. Trust me in this thing. Don't worry about the was. Don't worry about the is. If you'll push out into the deep water, watch what I'm about to do. We have no idea when we say yes to the small things, what that will produce, what it will potentially produce, who it will lead us to, what it will lead us to do, where it will lead us. We don't know what decisions and what directions we're going to take, what we can give, how we can serve, how we can love each other. We don't know. But it hung in the balance for Peter when Jesus said, push out into the deep. Verse 6 says, and when they had done so, notice that it doesn't say when they believed. When Peter believed, then he did as Jesus commanded. It doesn't say when he had prayed about it, and then, well, Jesus wants me to go, let me pray about this. Okay, I'll do it. It doesn't say, you know what, let me have a cup of coffee and think about it for a minute. It doesn't say any of that. It says that when he was called on, he acted. He acted on what Jesus had asked him to do. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Oh my goodness. They went from empty nets, empty boats, to cha-ching! Better than hitting the lottery. I'm sure Peter, his conversation with his wife probably changed at that point. He said, you know what, hey, we can get that new RV. And we can get that vacation house down in Egypt that you've been talking about and want to look at so much. And guess what? We're going to get a new boat. It's a Tesla boat. And then Peter responded this way. Verse 8 says, when Simon Peter saw this, he cried out, we're rich. We won't have to work for weeks, maybe even months. And immediately, Peter offered Jesus a 7-year contract, a 30% ownership, and a non-compete agreement to fish only for Peter. Is that what your Bible says? No? What does it say? He fell at the knees of Jesus. I can only imagine that Peter's filled with joy as he's pulling the nets up. He's ecstatic. He looks to the shore and signals for them. I'm sure he may have been a little too far to yell and scream for them. He signaled some kind of way. He waved or he nodded his head in some sort of way. And they came, and here comes James and John. And it says they fill the boat so full that both boats are starting to sink. Now, where are they again? In the deep. And the blessings of God are starting to sink their boat. Blessings of God are overwhelming. Because of Peter's obedience, because he was willing to say, you know what? I know what was, I know what is, I don't know what can be, but there's something special about this rabbi. I'm going to listen to him. And I'm going to trust him for just a moment. I'm curious to see what can be. What can be turned into a financial boom. Peter. I believe he senses that Jesus is about to change his life. He's about to ask him to leave everything and do this. Follow. Our calling is defined by our following. Peter's already been asked to be obedient. Now he's going to ask him to follow. And suddenly, fish are the furthest thing from Peter's mind. He fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Get out of here. Go away." One translation says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." Why did he want Jesus to leave? Because he knew. I believe in that moment he recognized the power of God in Jesus. He lived in the first century. God always separated himself and distanced himself from sinners, not just in Israelite religion, though God was close to them at times. That was our perception. That was what they wanted. God is going to be all the other gods around them were distant gods. And this God, the holy God, cannot be in the presence of sinful men. And Peter recognizes, I understand if you're not God, you're from him. He sent you. I'm a sinful man. Depart from me. Get away from me. You are holy. You cannot be in the presence of sin. Peter says, you have no business. I have no business being with you in this boat. But we know, or at least we have been taught, we are learning, that Jesus came to reverse all of this. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. He is not God away from us. God in the heavens who looks down and snarky and makes little comments and manipulates our lives and throws roadblocks in the way and decides who is saved and who's going to hell. He doesn't decide who's going to be blessed and who's not going to be blessed. He doesn't decide who's going to be 6'3" and look like Brad Pitt, and then who's going to look, be 5'10" and look like David. He doesn't do that. Jesus came to reverse that opinion of who God is and what God's purpose is, and what God wants. Jesus is establishing something different. He's establishing good news. Good news that brings hope. And we know, because we've read the rest of the story, Peter himself is going to become the first leader. He would stand up on the day of Pentecost and he would communicate this good news, this gospel with the world. But in that moment, Peter, on his knees in front of Jesus, fish flopping everywhere, I'm persuaded this is his reality. Either Peter leaves everything or Jesus leaves Peter. I'm persuaded that's the only option that he had. And I'll admit for myself, I'm way more comfortable with a God that comforts us rather than a God that confronts us. How many of you have gotten a pat on the back from mom or dad saying, you know what, it's going to be all right? Everything's going to be all right. I know you messed up real bad, but it's going to be all right. By the time I was 13, I didn't care when my mom came to do that. But when my mom came to confront me, David, you know better than to do this. You know better than to say this. You have been taught better. You know in the DNA of your soul that is not right. I didn't like it when my mama confronted me because it forced me to decide. Am I going to stay in the was? Am I going to stay in the is? Or am I going to move over here to the can be? You can be so much more than you are right now. There's so much more to this story that we could cover. As a matter of fact, I had about another 6 pages, but we are out of time, and I'm sure y'all are hungry. I want to end with this. As this particular story ends, there's Peter at Jesus' knees, pleading with him, go away. Now picture Jesus kind of getting down on his knees or coming down to Peter's face. And he says to Peter, don't be afraid. Jesus has to say that a lot to some people, doesn't he? Don't be afraid. Angels will say that, don't be afraid. There's something about the encounter with God that humbles you, helps you understand, oh, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. You're holy. You can't be in the presence of sin. And if you are in the presence of sin, you have to obliterate it. I don't want to be obliterated. One of us needs to leave. Here's God. He says, Peter, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. Peter's calling, our calling, is to fish for people. Well, I'm not very good with words. Well, I'm not very good with memory. I'm not very good at prayer. I don't understand. All these things don't come together. It doesn't matter. Preacher, it's easy for you to say you're up there with the Bible in your hand. You're up there with the sermon up on a piece of paper. You're up there. You've got all these gifts. You've got all this. It doesn't matter. You know how many people have been won from a pulpit? Zero. You know how many people have been won to Christ over a dinner table? Sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck out in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. How many people have been won over to Christ because you came over and brought a casserole after the death of someone in their family, or you just want to welcome them to the neighborhood? Don't be afraid. Jesus' call to all of us is to not be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. And our calling is defined this way. It's obedience plus follow. which leads to more obedience, which leads to more following. And I don't know which one comes first. I think obedience has to come first. But if you have to be obedient to something that you follow. So it's kind of an infinite circle that goes around. And the more you follow, the more you want to obey. And the more you obey, the closer you follow, the more you want to follow. And the more you follow, the more it just continues to build. And that is our calling, to be obedient, to follow. Be fishers of men. It's not limited to Peter. It's not limited to the 12. It's not limited to the preachers and the deacons and the elders or your teachers. Your call is to be fishers of men. So, are you going to sit in the boat on the shore? Are you going to push out just a few feet where it's still safe? Where you were, where you are you willing to launch out into the deep where you can be? And that decision is yours, one you make with Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior. Let's be standing. I think Mike has a good song picked out for us this morning. We're going to sing that. We're going to offer an invitation. If you have not named Jesus Christ as your Lord and as your Savior, now's the time to do it. Now's the time to launch that boat. Now's the time to look at what can be in your life. Mike?
God is calling the prodigal, come without delay. Hear, oh, hear him calling, calling now for thee. Though you wander so far from his presence, come today. Hear his loving voice calling still, calling now for thee. O weary prodigal, come, calling now for thee. O weary prodigal, come. Patient, loving, and tenderly still the Father pleads. Hear, oh, hear him calling, calling now for thee. Oh, return while the Spirit in mercy intercedes. Hear his loving voice calling still, calling now for thee. O weary prodigal, come, calling now for thee. O weary prodigal, come. All right, let's have a prayer and pray for the meal, pray for the food, and we'll be dismissed. Dear Lord, we come to you now as a close to our service. We hope that our hearts were in the right place. Our hearts were filled with gratitude, thankfulness, and lots of love and forgiveness. Lord, we know that you've forgiven us, and we've had a symbol today and some thoughts today to remind us of how much you've given us and forgave us. And you continue to provide for us each and every day. All of our needs have been met. And so, Lord, we thank you for that. We thank you for the food after this service. We thank you for the lovely hands that prepared it, and those who've thought ahead to bring something. Lord, we thank you for blessing us with this family, blessing us with the people that love us, and blessing us with Jesus. Amen.
May God's peace go with you all. Shalom and